I am so glad you're able to join us again. My name is Mike. I'm the pastor here at Shepherd of the Hills, and we are continuing our walk through the Bible. What I want to do today is I want to take a look at this fascinating passage we refer to as the Call of Moses. And this took place approximately 1400 BC. We don't have exact date in there, but that's a pretty good guess. And what has happened, to bring up the story so far, is God's people have been in Egypt for a couple hundred years at this point. Genesis ends with the family of Jacob being there in Israel. All his kids and grandkids and everybody else are there in in Egypt, because God has blessed Joseph. Joseph has been faithful. God has put his wisdom into Joseph. Joseph has become the guy second in charge of everything in Egypt. And when there's this giant famine in the land, Joseph has got the nation prepared. And because Egypt is prepared, they're able to bless and take in others, notably his own family. So they've all come down from the promised land. They're there. Now the thing is, after a couple hundred years, there's a Pharaoh in the land who does not remember Joseph. And that's where our story picks up. In chapter 2 of Genesis, we hear these words. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard them groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now, it's interesting, when you hear this language, you'll hear this phrase in the Old Testament, God remembered his people, or God remembered his cry, or God remembered Jonah in the belly of the whale. It's not that God has totally forgot in the way that I do sometimes, like I'll be sitting there at breakfast, drinking my coffee, thinking, something I was supposed to do today, I don't remember what it was. It's God remembering and recounting his promises. And so what you've got going on is that God is saying, yeah, these are my people. I promised them. I promised I would do these things for them. So what's going on here is, in this time, the people, the Pharaoh has put down this order that the midwives who are helping the Israelite women have babies should strangle the boys, because they're worried about the Israelites overpowering the Egyptians. They're worried about them doing so much that the Egyptians are going to be overwhelmed. And so that's what they're groaning about. That's what they're worried about. That's the fear. And in that context, there's Moses. Moses was raised in an Egyptian household. He was born an Israelite, but his mother put him in a basket, sent him down the river, and then he gets raised by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter takes him in as a foundling. So he's raised as a prince of Egypt. Now, gets in a fight with somebody, gets accused of murder, runs off into the wilderness, spends 40 years out in the wilderness. So he's 80 at this point. And that's when Moses runs into the burning bush. And this is where it picks up from chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock for his father-in-law Jethro, priest of Midian, and his flock was on the west side of the wilderness and came by Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out in the middle of the bush. And he looked up, and behold, the bush was burning, and it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, and why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside, God called him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off of your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid of God. All right, let's stop here for a second. There's a couple things I want to pull out of this. Sometimes you'll see this particularly in the Old Testament, where it says the angel appeared, and then a moment later it's God speaking. And don't be alarmed by that or confused by that. It's just the way the Old Testament is written. The reality and what we need to focus on is that it's God working in this situation. And so here's Moses out doing his day job. He is out working in the fields, he's tending the sheep, and God appears to him in this fashion. Now, one of the things that we always need to remember is that God can appear to us wherever we need be. We do regard certain places as holy, we do regard certain places as sanctified, but that doesn't mean that those are the only places God shows up. God shows up at all sorts of different places in all sorts of different circumstances. All right, so picking it up again with verse 7. The Lord says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I know I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and bring them out of the land to a good and broad land, land flowing with milk and honey. The place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the children out of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, it is interesting that God calls the Israelites my people. He's very intent on that, very focused on that. My people. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? But I will, and he says, God says, but I will be with you, for this shall be a sign that I have sent you. When you have brought out the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And what he's talking about is this place of worship. Now, this is interesting because Moses, who we like to think is this great guy, I cannot tell you how many stained glass pictures I have seen of Moses and others like him. Actually, Moses is this great guy. But when God calls Moses, God speaks to Moses out of a burning bush, Moses is like, not me, not going, not going to do it. And this is a natural thing. We do this. When God calls us, we come up with excuses. We say we don't want to, we're not ready to do it, we're not called to do it, we're not the right person. And we offer these excuses. Happened back then, happens now. It is part of the human condition. So Moses says to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask, who is his name? What shall I send him? And God says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons. And I want to spend some time on this. What we're revealing is God's character. And what he's doing to describe himself is saying that he doesn't have any beginning or end. It's not any descriptor because nothing in the language can capture that. And so he's saying he is the one without beginning, without end. He is capturing all that power in his name. Now, sometimes you'll hear this as Yahweh or as Jehovah or as Adonai. And I actually have here, this is the Hebrew, the modern Hebrew of the way it would be written. And what that is the Hebrew is written without vowels. So the vowels are, if we were doing this modern ways, we would have the vowels pointed above or below. This is just the consonants. So in that Hebrew, what happens is that's just those first letters. And it's, put over here, it is, sorry, I grabbed the wrong one, but it is Yad, He, Wo, He, Y-H-W-H. That's where that comes from, Yahweh. So we put the vowels and it gets pronounced Yahweh. Sometimes you'll hear that as Jehovah, and that's just a transliteration of that with the Y's to the J's, and so that's where that comes from. Sometimes you'll hear the term Adonai, which is actually my Lord. Now, it's very important. The Jews never wanted to take the name of the Lord in vain. So what they would do is they would never pronounce that. They would never say Yahweh. It was intentionally unpronounceable because they didn't want to accidentally blaspheme God. They wanted to be very respectful. And that first, that commandment, you shall have no other, You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. I'm very serious about that. Something that we tend not to be very serious about today in modern American culture. One of those little things that drives me a little crazy. But that's where that whole thing comes from. That's where we get Yahweh. That's where the whole Adonai, Jehovah, that's where it all comes out of this passage. And it's really God's character that we're seeing when God's saying, I am who I am. And he's claiming he has the power and the authority to do whatever he wants. So, the passage goes on to this, where he says, where Moses continues to give these excuses. And, actually here, let me pass it one more time here. When he says the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what he's doing is he's looping back to this before. He's looping back to the way that he has reached out to this family, these people, this nation before. And so he goes on, this is my name forever, and I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Okay, so he goes on, makes some promises, and then what happens is Moses gets, let me skip down to chapter 4, verse 10, and he starts making excuses. He says, but Moses said, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Now, a lot of people interpret that saying that Moses has a stutter. And I think that's a reasonable explanation of this. That is really interesting that God is choosing somebody who cannot speak clearly to go speak to Pharaoh, who was the most powerful man in the world at the time. God loves irony. He does this all the time. And he does this to show who he is and how powerful he is, that he can take the person who stutters and spent 40 years out in the wilderness as a shepherd, and he says, yeah, I'm going to send this guy to go speak to Pharaoh. Now, what's interesting is God says, okay, who made man's mouth? Who made him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not me, the Lord? Now, therefore, go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what to speak. But Moses says, oh my Lord, please somebody send somebody else. Now, actually, let me read this next verse here. Then the anger of the Lord kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming to meet you, and when he sees you, he shall be glad in his heart. Now, a lot of people interpret that to say that what God was saying there is, if you had trusted me, I would have healed your stutter. And what God is saying is, okay, fine, you don't trust me, therefore you can use your brother to speak. This is interesting a couple of different ways. Sometimes God wants us to grow. Actually, God, I think, wants us to grow all the time. And sometimes because we get so wrapped up in our own fears and what we say we can't do, that we choose not to. Now, what happens here with Aaron is God says, I'm going to use this guy to speak for you. I'm going to use this guy to work with you and this guy to do the stuff that you can't do. Bring somebody along. And it is a wonderful way for us to remember God's call in our lives. It's a wonderful way to remember that we're called to work together. And the whole idea of the church is that we are knit together in what Jesus has done for us, and we're knit together to help one another. We're knit together to give each other wisdom, to give each other counsel, and to do the stuff that we can't do. Now, that's where I want to end the reading today. The whole story is a fascinating one, and the whole story of how God works through these things, and God does amazing things in Pharaoh's court and brings his people out of Egypt is just, it's the stuff that more movies have been made out of than I can count. And there's a reason that they keep making movies out of it. It's because it's such an amazing story. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to let you catch up with your group, and then I've got some discussion questions for you. First question. How do you feel about God using somebody as flawed as Moses for his plans? Moses had committed murder. Moses was stuttering. Moses had spent 40 years out in the wilderness. How do you feel about somebody like that leading God's people? And question 2. Why do you think God used a burning bush to get Moses' attention? He could have just started speaking. He could have had an angel there. But he uses this burning bush to get Moses' attention, and then he starts speaking. Why do you think that is? Okay, let's get inside Moses' head for a second. Who do you think he is more uncertain about? Himself or God? He could be uncertain about himself because he spent 40 years out in the wilderness. He could be uncertain about because he's stuttered. He could be uncertain about God because he's never met God before. He's heard the stories. But what do you think is going through his head? Where is that doubt coming from? Let's unpack that I am for a moment. What about God saying I am in response to his name? What about that stands out to you? What does that mean to you today, 3,400 years after God spoke that to Moses? Next question. Why do you think God waited so long to rescue his people in Egypt? We often in our own lives feel like we've been waiting forever. Why do you think God waited so long to send Moses to help his people, to bring them out of slavery? What can we learn from this today? Next question. Have you run into a circumstance where you felt like you were standing on holy ground in a place that you didn't expect it? Has God come to you in some place that normally is just a place, but he does something amazing? When God speaks to Moses, he says, I'm going to send the people to his land flowing with milk and honey. And for them, that meant it was a place that was rich in food and in resources. What would that be for you today? What would it be that you need God to bless you with? Something relationship-wise, something financial? What is it that you would feel secure in? Okay, let's talk about when God gets angry with Moses. Why do you think God gets so angry with Moses? Why do you think he gets so frustrated? Two last questions. God offers implicitly to take away Moses' stuttering, to heal his mouth. How has God exercised his sovereignty over your limitations, over those places where you feel like you can't get anywhere? What has God done for you there? Last question. Who's been the Aaron in your life? That person who's come alongside you, helped you, spoken for you when you didn't know what to say. How have they blessed you? Thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been a blessing to you. We will continue with these Bible studies. It has been so much fun, and I hope you have been enjoying them too. Thank you, and we hope you have a blessed week.